Violence against the elderly has been reported in some parts of the country. Pensioners, widows and the elderly have all fallen victim to crime in rural communities. Well, this is crime, theft as well as gender-based violence continues to grow amongst communities. And to take this discussion further, we have roped in Dr. Lesley Ann Foster, who is the founder and executive director of the Masimanyane Women's Rights International. Doctor, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Look, the abuse of elderly women in the rural areas, particularly in the Eastern Cape, seems to be on the rise. Let's reflect on the detriment of this act in communities and what can be done by the very communities to protect some of its members.
Yes, it's very sad. We've been hearing many more reports of acts of violence against elderly. And apparently it's linked to their pensions, where women are expected to pay over a part of their pensions to avoid being raped. We've heard this quite from several villages in the Eastern Cape, and this is happening. I think what part of the problem is that the prevention programs that we do have are not extended into the rural areas. In fact, a lot of the resources available to prevent violence against women are not available to rural communities, and this is a really big problem. Today I got a report also about police stations. So I think there is a problem around policing, which is very serious. In some areas, we are told that police stations close their gates at 6 o'clock and that the police are not accessible to communities. We also know from our own working communities that police have very limited resources, so that they may have 4 vehicles, but 3 of them are not working. And to get them to work, there's a very long administrative process, which prevents that from happening. Also, the visibility of police in areas is not there. So it's a complex issue of a lack of access to information and knowledge, a lack of access to support mechanisms that we see, and then the poverty and inequality makes women very, very vulnerable to this violence, particularly the elderly. We hear a lot of stories about violence towards the elderly, and this is not being adequately addressed.
And doctor, what are the exacerbating factors then, you think? Because we understand, if you are targeting the elderly as well as the widows, the women that stay alone, so you basically targeting people that are the most vulnerable in society. So what can be done? And also back to my earlier point, what is exacerbating this type of violence, do you think?
Well, for sure, we know it's inequality. We know that women's lives don't matter. There's less. What do we say? Women's lives, bodies are commodified, and if they're poor and they're vulnerable, they become more easily prey to violence of men in their communities. So the problem is exacerbated by poverty, by lack of access to information, by a lack of support mechanisms. There aren't support mechanisms within the rural areas that actually protect older women, widows. They're much more vulnerable. And often the older women are put into a separate home or a separate abode within a compound where they live on their own. So they don't have that kind of, protection. And often, we've heard cases in Pedi and areas like that where even if there is a child in the home, then the child and the woman will be vulnerable. So it's that, how do we support older women is the big question. And, at the National Strategic Summit on Violence Against Women, the issue around violence towards older women was discussed. And older women themselves were asking whether we could have a village, in an area where they just have older women and where there are people put in place to take care of them. But we don't have a strategy for addressing the vulnerability of older women in our communities at the moment. And this is something that we will, because I've come to hear about it this morning in a different context, we'll bring it up. I've already taken it up with SABC as to why police stations are closed and so forth. But older women have less value to their families and their communities, and that's what makes them very vulnerable. So it's when we talk about gender inequality, it's about the low status of women in society, the norms, the behavior and attitudes of communities towards older women. So in the Eastern Cape, we still see the stoning of older women happening from time to time. Because they are thought, to be witches and things like that. So unfortunately, it's still there. And we're not reaching communities, rural communities with our programs. We work in some areas in the rural area, but if you think about it, we can visit one village where there may be 100 villages in a particular area.
Yeah.
And so we really do need countrywide campaigns that can reach people through the radio, because television is not something people have access to easily, but they can get information from the radio. And then families need to take, and communities need to take responsibilities for older people, to providing them with support. And this notion that women have to pay for their lives, they have to take a portion of their money and leave it on a windowsill to prevent being raped or killed. We report these issues, but we don't get feedback as to whether they've actually been addressed. We've had chiefs tell us how vulnerable women are in their communities. We have chiefs writing to the National Minister for women, youth and people with disabilities, to complain about what is happening in their villages. But we don't extend the programs that we do have as a country, as government, into those rural areas. And that's the big issue, the problems that we have. It's a lack of access, lack of reach that people have, and then the support mechanisms.
I mean, speaking of support mechanisms as well as village and far-flung areas, Doctor, I mean, the structures in some of the villages is not one that was meant to deal with such violence. And then what can communities themselves do if police are, as you said, under-resourced and understaffed? I mean, what can those basic community policing forums in collaborative efforts then with SABC do to ensure the safety of the most vulnerable in their society? Very quickly.
Right. Community safety forums can have teams of people that do patrolling, at night and watch over the people. So I think if there's a greater presence of people that are looking after the elderly, then they would be safer. And they're not doing enough of that. We don't hear about that. In some communities, you do hear very active community policing forums. But I think those kinds of things, made up of men and women who go out at night particularly, they can even have somebody on watch, that can be, tonight it's your turn to have, watching people, and then that can have some, some value. But there's great fear in the communities. We encountered in Lusiki, Siki, Matatiel, all of those areas, that there's great fear around the women and wanting to, not believing and trusting that the community policing forums will actually take care of them. The fear is a real issue, because there is violence that's happening, and it's happening at quite a rate. It's also underreported. I think if we reported these cases a lot more, then the police would have to do something about it. They are under-resourced. There's not enough police. They don't have enough cars and so forth to go there to check all the stations and the villages, and I think that's what's important as well, is to get the police properly resourced. They don't do it in rural areas. I can tell you that they're under-resourced greatly. Yeah,
absolutely. We're going to leave it there, Doctor. And I suppose, in far-flung areas, accessibility to those, villages that need assistance has to be a huge problem, judging by the current state of roads in some of those towns. We're going to leave it there. Thank you so much. That is Dr. Lesley Ann Foster of the Masimanyane Women's Right International.